Welcome to yCITIES Inside the Mind of an Investor series. yCITIES cultivates an intergenerational innovation ecosystem from middle schoolers and beyond, supporting a diverse pipeline of tomorrow's founders and investors. Angel investors are a vital part of the startup community. While there are plenty of resources about how to pitch or how the process works, it can still seem like a black box as to why an investor chooses to invest or not only to the founders, but also to peer investors. So we decided that we wanted to have many conversations with many different investors and to focus on one investor at a time. Every interview is anchored by the same 5 questions, but each conversation is shaped through follow-up questions influenced by the different lenses of our panel hosts. Today, I'm super excited to introduce our guest investor. Welcome, Debi.
Hi, thank you.
Hey, Debi, it's great to have you on today. Why don't we start by, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of your backstory that led you to investing, maybe a little bit about your thesis, if you will. We love to hear about risk tolerances and any other gems you can give us about kind of what got you into this game. It'd be greatly appreciated. And again, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Well, so I've been, I'd say, deeply involved in the Boston innovation ecosystem for 15 years now or so. I was working in startups way back. I guess I started working in startups around in the late 90s. And then I got very involved in the Boston community, running a trade organization that actually represented all the startups and the digital companies that we were trying to grow in our innovation ecosystem. And then from there, it just really ignited my passion for working with startups. So I spent many years working with lots of different startups. Most recently, I was the head of entrepreneurship center at Babson College, which is really well known for entrepreneurship, and our students are very, very entrepreneurial. So I helped hundreds of students every year work on very early stage ventures. I left there about a year ago, and I now run an accelerator and education program for former elite athletes who have startups and want to take those startups to the next level. So I'd say I'm an educator, a connector, a mentor, and then a sometimes investor. But it's all kind of wrapped in and around this desire to work with startups and particularly very early stage founders. That's really my sweet spot, and that's what I love to do. And so becoming an investor was just kind of a natural outgrowth of all that work. It was sort of, I've worked on so many advisory boards, and it just became sort of like, well, if you're going to be an advisor, you should probably also be an investor. I strongly believe that when I hear other people pitch me, I always ask, are those advisors also investors? Because I think it's important signal. So for me, I had to kind of, do what I preach. And so I started to become an investor in the companies that I worked with as a direct investor. And then later I joined like a well-formed traditional angel group about 2 years ago and have been investing through that quite a bit. And then I set up my own syndicate that I have now also, where I do some angel investing with some friends and colleagues from previous lives.
Awesome. Well, as a proud Babson alum, I appreciate the plug and shout out for Babson. So a little bit about your risk tolerance. What are some of the things you look for in investments? And
how early is early? Because that can also have a little bit of a range as well. Because you mentioned that early is like your sweet spot, and that kind of dovetails with Sean's question of the risk tolerance piece.
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually pre-seed or seed round. So typically what an angel would be. So sort of maybe MVP, maybe pilot market or beta market, just getting a general sense of feasibility and getting some really good market information. I mean, that's pretty early. I wouldn't say I've ever invested just on an idea on a napkin, but I definitely am pretty early in the scheme of things. But I like to know that the entrepreneur has done a bit of work to really start to understand the market and know that they understand their customer really well. That's pretty important to me. So I guess I'd say my risk tolerance is high, but I also have set aside a certain amount of money that I will invest. And when that's done, I'm done. So it's not like this limitless thing where I'm just going to keep investing in startups as long as I can. I want to, but that's not feasible for me. So I have a certain amount of money. And What's
that certain amount of money, is it like bucketed where like the very high risky ones like, is it a subcategory out of the investment money, or most of it is just higher risk? And when it's okay.
Yeah, it's, for me, it's all categorized as my angel investments. And so that bucket of money is what it is. And I spend it as I can. And I always spend all of it that I've budgeted. But after that, I don't go any higher. So I would say my risk tolerance is high because obviously I'm investing really, really early, but I also have kind of bounded it. So I'm not going to just keep spending money on early stage startups without regard, because I can't do that. I can't afford to do that.
Student, I find it super cool that you like worked at Babson. And what was your favorite part about like working with student entrepreneurs? And did you feel like student entrepreneurs could kind of like hold their own against like adults in the world of startups, I guess?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I love working with student entrepreneurs, and I still do work with a lot of student entrepreneurs in my consulting work. And I'm still very close to a lot of my Babson students who have gone on to create some really successful companies. I would say that in many cases, student entrepreneurs can hold their own against older entrepreneurs or more experienced entrepreneurs. Where you start to see a difference is in industries where a certain amount of domain experience might be required to kind of know the problem well enough to solve it in the right way. And or, student entrepreneurs tend to not have as big of a network as an experienced entrepreneur might have, or someone coming out of corporate might have. And so that hinders them a bit too. So, what I saw as part of my role was helping them build those two things, like helping them get information from the market that would help them for their lack of domain experience potentially, or also being a connector for them and helping them get into the networks that they needed in order to make their startups go. So their capacity for doing startups is there for sure. Their passion, their energy is amazing. I mean, that was the thing I loved most about Babson, is the energy around entrepreneurship there is just electric. And it's so fun. And, everybody really believes in their ability to be an entrepreneur there. And I think it's very, very cool. So I love working with student entrepreneurs, and I hope to do it for as long as I can.
I love how you mentioned the bond that you have and how you're still in touch with them. So Duani actually was a student of mine when she was in middle school, and she's a freshman at Columbia right now. So clearly we're still in touch. And
wow. Yeah, that's a long time.
She's done amazing things.
I'm in my dorm right now.
You mentioned you work with the former athletes who are now entrepreneurs. Are the athletes like former athletes? Do they have ventures in a wide variety of different areas, or is it usually kind of like sports or related?
I would say it's all areas. I mean, I've worked with entrepreneurs that are former athletes in all areas: hardware, software, consumer, B2B. But the majority have been in sports or health and wellness, things that they know well. Like any entrepreneur, they tend to work on problems that they've experienced themselves. And that's a good thing, because they really, tend to understand the ins and outs of that, or potentially already have a network in that area. So yeah, there's a lot in the sports tech area, but that's an area that I love. Like health and wellness and sports tech, I would say, are areas that I invest in quite a bit and have for a long time. So that works for me. And I think that the interesting thing about working with former elite athletes is that, they're transitioning from sport. So it's almost like working with student entrepreneurs in the sense that they're kind of trying to find their identity as an entrepreneur versus, having been an athlete their whole lives. Now they're an entrepreneur, and trying to build that identity with them is something that I do work on too. It's sort of that softer side of becoming an entrepreneur versus, all the hard stuff that goes into building a company. So we do work on that too.
You work with a lot of first-time founders because of all the different areas you're in and the things that you like and care about. It seems like the vast majority are going to be first-time founders.
Yeah, that's a good point, Vicki. That's very true. The vast majority of the founders I work with are first-time founders. And I think that, particularly with the athlete founders, they come with a set of characteristics that are very similar to the characteristics that make great founders of startups, right? They're leaders, they're team players, they're incredibly resilient, they're diligent, they're disciplined. All those things, are characteristics of a great founder, and sort of that softer side, or those intangibles that kind of make for great founders. So it's very fun to work with them.
I guess kind of like in that vein, like, when you look at a startup, do you place more importance on the founder, like a personable founder and a great team, or do you look at the market opportunity? Like, which side of the debate are you on?
I would say I lean more toward the founder side. Because I'm an angel investor, I tend to only invest in companies where I feel like I can add something else besides just money. And so for that reason, I tend to find founders that I want to work with, because I'm going to dive deep with them and I'm going to spend a lot of time with them. So I guess I lean more on that founder side, just because I really like to get to know them personally. I really like to know, what they're all about and what's motivating them to do this, because I know how hard it is to be successful, and I want to believe that they have what it takes to go the distance. And I also know that entrepreneurship can be very lonely. So I want to be there for them where I can. So a lot of it depends on, working with an entrepreneur that I feel a connection with personally, and that I feel has the stuff to be successful.
Now I'm going to dig into that, the stuff. Can you define that a little bit? I know it's maybe an umbrella term, but can you kind of give a little bit of what that would be or mean?
Yeah, sure. Sean, a lot of it is sort of what I talked a little bit about with athletes, right? I'm looking for people who are very resilient. I'm looking for people who will bust through walls to make this startup come to life. Like, they will do anything to make it happen, and I truly believe it. They are people that I feel have a high level of self-awareness about themselves and their capacity. I look for people who have a lot of horsepower, who are just plain old smart. And I look for people who, are basing their companies and what they want to build on a set of values that are very dear to them. That's important to me. And I feel like it's never too early to have those conversations with an entrepreneur. Are you building this in a values-based way? Are you building this, thinking about, when you are a giant successful company, what's the mark you're going to leave on the universe?
I love it. Thank you.
You talked a little bit about this sort of market research that you're expecting from these founders, in ways that sort of, you're, as you say, you're dealing with a lot of first-time founders. But can you elaborate a little bit more on the types of validation that you need to see these founders having proven? So, like, obviously, if they're talking more sports founders, they might be like, oh, I personally suffered an injury or something like that. But that doesn't necessarily tell you how large the market is or the cost of that market for different people. So what's your expectation sort of on proof?
I think there are two things that I would call sort of that market research validation for me. One is just simply, have they talked to potential customers of their service or product, and a lot of them, and not their friends.
Do you have like a number that you usually ask? Like, so for example, like working with hardware founders, our expectation is that they talk to like at least 300 people in the span of 15 weeks. And that's B2B. So what's the expectation for you on the healthcare side, or like if any of these teams are working with more B2C? Do you have roughly a number of your expectation to show a proof of
I think part of it depends on the industry that they're in, but I've always kind of said around 100 was a number that I liked personally, because you're going to hear, what you want to do is hear who is your customer and learn about them, but you also want to hear who isn't your customer, because you might be going in with a certain set of assumptions about who your customer is. And so it's just as valuable to find out that someone actually isn't a customer for what you want to build as it is to find out they are a customer. So you have to have a pretty big sample size to get all of that. And I think the challenging part is I'm very specific. Like, it can't be your mom, it can't be your neighbor, it can't be your fraternity brothers. I want to know, or your teammates. I want to know you talk to like dead ass strangers about this product and didn't lead them. And like, I do spend a lot of time trying to coach them on how you do those types of customer discovery interviews so that you're getting really good information. And then the other thing, you know, in sort of that market research realm that I look for that's really important to me is I often start my meetings with entrepreneurs on what is your unique insight into this market. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a founder who has a very unique insight, whether it's an intersection of trends that I've never heard anyone talk about, or it's an angle or perspective on an existing industry that I've never heard before, or it's an insight about the target customer that I've never heard before. So I'm looking for some deep insight around you know, what they're trying to build. And an insight by definition is something that's non-obvious. So I'm looking for a non-obvious idea or sense about what they're trying to build. And it's actually pretty, when you boil it down to that, it's actually pretty easy to tell if they have something insightful going. And then if I sit there and I go, wow, that's super insightful, I am all in. Like, I am like with them. I'm like, let's do this, because it's very hard to find a unique insight these days. There's a lot that's already known, but there's also a lot that isn't known yet. So I find that tends to be a really good test of what they know about their market or what they've learned about their market by doing market research.
So given, you know, how, you know, crazy busy you are, and you must get so many pitches, and then on top of that, because of the students that you like to work with and the athletes, we already mentioned that there's a, you know, probably a higher percentage of first-time founders. How do you sift through that? It's one thing, like, because you mentioned, okay, you lean towards the founder, you know, but how do you know who you want to kind of spend more time with when you're kind of in the screening stage only? Do you find that a lot of them already know how to convey like that unique insight? Because if all of them were able to articulate that, then that would be easy, right? You're like, okay, let me flip really quickly. How many have unique insights? Check, check, check. Nope, don't have. But I imagine realistically, that's not the case, or maybe it is, and I don't know, right? So how do you organize, you know, efficiently who to, you know, which introduction, or, you know, a lot of first-time founders you mentioned also don't have like a network. So maybe it's not an introduction. Which cold call, which submission, which, you know, screening thing do you say, okay, like, I want to know more. I want to see if they have a unique insight.
Yeah, I mean, it is very challenging, particularly when you get a volume of pitches or outreach, and you do want to give everybody a fair shake to a certain extent as you can. You know, for me, a lot of it is certainly, you know, do I know anything about this industry that's valuable to them? Can I actually be helpful to them? But the other piece is that I wrote a book about pitching. So I wrote a book, it's called First Pitch, and it's all about pitching and how you communicate with investors and mentors and advisors and build relationships in the process of starting a company as an entrepreneur. So I've done a lot of work kind of thinking about that problem, and so maybe that's good or maybe that's bad, I'm not sure. But for me, I feel like I've heard it all, and so there's just sort of I just have a sense about people that I talk to. If do they have that it factor, in my definition of what an it factor is. But I try very consciously to not let sort of my own unconscious bias kind of play a role, and that's hard to do. Admittedly, that's very, very hard to do. But I am looking for a company where I know something that could be helpful to them, or I know people who could be helpful to them. Because the last thing I want to do is just give them money and then not do anything. So I prefer to be involved. So that's always going to be the first kind of question: is it something that I know how, you know, can I be useful to them in some way? I guess when I'm just plain old looking at pitch decks, I am looking at how they communicate, because that's going to be hugely important. You know, there's only so much coaching you can do for someone. And if they're not a good communicator, it is very, very hard for me to want to dive in, because I feel like, you know, by the time you've gotten to college, you should probably know how to write a decent business email. You should probably know how to make an introduction of yourself. And if you don't, that's just harder for me because I feel like,
Or sort of a self-filter on its own, right? If it can't capture your attention in that initial stage, then
I mean, I feel like there's just sort of some base level characteristics you have to be able to demonstrate as an entrepreneur. And if you feel like you don't have them, if you feel like you're weak in them as an entrepreneur and you're like, oh my God, that's really going to hurt me if I want to pitch Debi or whoever, get help. Like there's so much help. It's absurd how much help there is on the internet, on YouTube, on Twitter. There's like massive amounts of help. So I just feel like not knowing how is not a great excuse anymore, because all you have to do is type into that search bar and you will find massive amounts of information to help you in this process. So I feel like if you can't take the initiative to do that, how are you going to have the initiative to be an entrepreneur? Because it takes a lot of initiative.
So we have a lot of savvy listeners. I'd say many folks you'd classify as like underrepresented folks. I say savvy and kind of pull it in with the underrepresented to say like, okay, they're on YouTube, they're on Twitter, they're looking up this information, they're kind of tooling themselves. When you kind of look at the industry's had challenge, or those individuals, better said, have had challenges of getting in front of investors, of getting funds. That pipeline to a lot of underrepresented founders is definitely there's a flow, but it's a trickle. What would you recommend? What would you recommend from a kind of investment community perspective to kind of help in fielding more swings on ball for those folks? How can we get more opportunities for those founders by the investment community, you think?
Yeah, I think that you got to follow the money, right? And it's got to start with LPs. It's got to start with the people who are giving the investors money. And for angels like me who are using their own money, it's got to start with me being very deliberate about making sure I am using a percentage of my time on people who are traditionally underrepresented, and very consciously doing that. In the VC world, though, I mean, it's just so broken. And the only way to fix it is literally going all the way back in the funnel to the LPs, and for LPs to say, I am not going to give you my millions to manage in your fund unless you do these 3 things or these 5 things that are going to open your eyes to underrepresented founders. I don't think it's possible for the entrepreneurs to do this without going all the way back in the funnel and getting LPs to care about this, make it a metric that they are insisting on, make it mandatory for anybody who's going to manage their money or they're going to give their money to, that they start to pay attention to these things and do very deliberate things to change. I think that's really the only way.
Yeah, I think I align with you on that with respects to certainly, if what the limited partners want, for sure. Then those folks holding their money will aim to achieve what they're looking for. And then
they will do it.
In my mind, exactly, they will do it. And then on the other end, it's like, for me, it's helping to really make sure that, folks are getting the exposure to other entrepreneurs, that are getting, all of the tools like I talked about. You can go to the YouTube, go to Twitter. There's information that's widely available. Make sure you onboard that. But no doubt, I think that I agree that it also starts with the LPs.
Yeah. I mean, you think about like the corollary for that is sort of like, you think about like the stock market, for example, or in the big pension funds that invest huge amounts of money in the stock market. If those pension funds start to say, well, I really want to see you invest in companies that are sustainable and thinking about sustainability, then the investment managers are going to start to do that, because that's where the money's coming from. I mean, it's just the way of the world. So I think that's unfortunately the only way to go. And that means that we all have to make this next generation of investors coming up in the world knowledgeable, helpful, give them the tools they need to be great investors, and recognize when they're operating with a certain amount of bias. Be self-aware.
Do you have any suggestions on sort of resources that would allow future investors to sort of think through that? I mean, obviously yourself, you're very knowledgeable, you're engaging with the younger generation already and early first founders. So on sort of both sides, like, you know, people who want to get into investing, you know, what are the resources they should be looking for? And then, you know, founders, you sort of mentioned looking at LPs, but I don't think that always first time founders know how to get into that. I know there's sometimes articles out there, but it can sort of be you know, a rabbit hole, if you will, of plethora of information of trying to figure out where an LP might be the person who's backing a fund. Do you have any suggestions on that front?
Well, I don't think it's the job of the founder to convince the LPs to do that. I think that's the job of the LP to educate themselves and then require that of the people they're giving their money to. So it is the LP's job to be a better, more conscious LP in the world, and that's what we really need. That's what's going to create change. But for entrepreneurs or people who are just starting out in the world of investing, I think there's some really great VCs who have started funds in this area that are doing incredible things, and they're prolific. They write so much. They write on Medium, they write on Twitter, they write on LinkedIn, and they talk about, you know, their thought process. They talk about, you know, how they're doing these kinds of things and creating processes that take out as much bias as possible. So Vicki and Sean, you might remember there was something in our Slack channel a while back about how you create a non-biased screening process, right? And that was so interesting because it was sort of saying, we're only going to ask these 5 questions, and we're going to ask them of everyone, and we're not going to stray from these 5 questions when we're screening a deal. And we're going to take all the ability to tell who the entrepreneur is, what gender or race or whatever is, out of the screening process and make it completely, you know, blind, neutral. And it takes a commitment like that to, you know, redo processes that are inherently broken.
So I was just going to say, you know, definitely there's like a lot of moving pieces, and I don't think it's any like one area, right? There's a lot of things that have to be chipped away. You know, and you definitely suggested a few of them. I want to circle back because I think it's all kind of related. You mentioned at the beginning about how students, and I think you also mentioned athletes who, you know, again, coming back to the first time founders, a lot of times underrepresented founders are also first time founders. So there are sort of like overlaps. And I was curious as to, you know, your model that you've kind of created to help students and athletes. I'm not saying that you can directly lift that model that you use to help the athletes into addressing this, but there might be kind of like some key concepts or things that you figured out to you know, like meet the athletes who are not normally, you know, in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. They're not going to necessarily know the type of folks that maybe some of us, you know, do know really well. And, you know, all the tools, all the resources beyond Google. And we all know like Googling things, you don't necessarily, you know, whether it's like a medical question or, you know, anything, there's good and bad sources. And some folks may not know how to like, you know, filter through that. And other folks are, you know, more privileged to be able to have folks that they can have as a sounding board. You know, since you do know the athlete part and the student part, can you speak to a couple of maybe, you know, some highlights of how you've helped them? Because I think that conversation can open up, you know, and somebody might think of an idea springboarding off of what you've done so far.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a whole chapter on bias in my book, and it's a lot of what I write about in confronting bias in the pitch process is based on a study from Columbia Business School, actually. A bunch of researchers watched pitches over and over and over, hundreds of pitches, and they looked at the questions that investors asked the entrepreneurs. And what they found was that men were getting asked what they called promotion questions, and promotion questions are about vision and about big ideas and growth. And women were getting asked questions about that were what they called prevention questions. And prevention questions are about mitigating risk and how do you not fail. And so, and this was unconscious by the investors. It was female and male investors who were doing this. So it wasn't just male investors who were doing this. And so what they found was that people who get asked promotion questions will tend to answer with a promotion answer, and people who are asked prevention questions will answer with a prevention answer. And the data tells us that people who are asked a promotion question will raise 7 times more money than someone that is asked a prevention-based question. And so knowing this, knowing that, and you know, I think very safely you could transfer this to any type of underrepresented entrepreneur, this concept of the types of questions that you're asked. And so what I have done in my practice has been to try and teach and train the entrepreneurs that I work with to be able to spot a prevention question versus a promotion question. And with time, learn how to give a promotion answer to a prevention question. So I call it a spot it and switch it. So where they're, you know, they're noticing that they're getting, you know, maybe I'm pitching and I'm noticing that I'm getting a prevention question. You know, how are you going to retain users versus how am I going to, you know, grow 20% next year? Spot it and then switch it to a promotion answer and talk about what I want to talk about, which is about growth, not about, you know, not failing. I want to talk about winning. And so I try and teach them to do the spot it and switch it. And it's hard. It does take time to notice it. And it takes a little bit of grace to switch it. But over time, you know, if you pitch enough, you will learn and you will see patterns become pretty clear and you can do it.
I was just going to say, like, that's funny in my mind that, you know, I've been doing a lot of my own consumption of like systems thinking. And on one end, it's almost like the prevention questions are the kind of drift to low performance where they're trying to like basically drag you in a particular direction,
Right.
you know, conscious or not, drag you down, while the other end is like success to the successful, right? And
Exactly.
promotion and trying to help you lift. It'd be interesting to a thought exercise to think about if there's a way to, I think you were saying like spot it and was it spot and pivot or?
Spot it and switch it. So switch it from a prevention to a promotion.
Great.
Yeah.
So this is coined by Debbie. We got it. Like, is this in your book as well?
Yeah, I love it.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love
it's in my book as well. But I think that, and part of that is not only teaching entrepreneurs, but it's also teaching investors to notice when they are asking a prevention question. So, you know, to be self-aware on yourself, like, am I asking, like, am I doing this? Because it is very self-conscious, and I'd like to believe it's always self-conscious. We don't realize we're doing it. So as we become more aware of ourselves asking a prevention question to an underrepresented entrepreneur, we can spot it and switch it too.
I was going to quickly ask, like, you know, you're talking about these little tips and tricks of how to spot it and sort of like this pattern recognition. But I don't know, I was just wondering if you had like maybe 1 or 2 key sort of ways of identifying it earlier, or like, you know, what should people be watching out for if you were to say like, this is the golden star of an example?
Well, I mean, there are always clues, right? I mean, you can tell by the way an investor might answer your email, or, you know, sort of how they approach things. There's clues in tone. There's clues in, I mean, unfortunately, there's clues in body language, which we don't have a lot of right now, but we will soon. There are clues. I mean, that's why I think EQ is such an important part of being a good entrepreneur, is being able to read people and kind of see what's underneath the surface, you know, and have a sense of that with people. So I think there are clues. And what I say is, like, if you're getting the vibe that this is not the investor for you, then it's not the investor for you. And that's okay. Walk away. Like, don't waste your time, because you're not going to change them. Like, I am not going to change somebody's mind myself as an entrepreneur. But, you know, there are plenty of investors who aren't like that. So don't waste your time. If you're getting that vibe, if you're getting, you know, prevention question after prevention question after prevention question, and they're just not stopping, be graceful, be kind, be gracious, and just say thank you for your time. See ya.
That's a perfect ending.
Yeah, I know. I was like, that was a beautiful way to conclude. So thank you so much for joining us today. And this concludes this episode of Inside the Mind of an Investor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.